Many ask about the qualifications of President Trump and other officials that are actively promoted in the news, and thus the answer, of course, is whether or not they pass the legal functions to have been certified for the position in a free society from the law, which is a sober, educated answer. And thus the action of his support for the Constitution, thus the support of the obligation for the right of the people to pursue the government for a redress of grievances, and thus the function of the dual, which is that any government that is destructive of the means of rights must be altered or abolished, and it is the right of the people, and it is the duty of the people to do so, and to reform a new government administration and its constitution in view of their image, and thus the expression of their intentions on this affair, and thus the mechanism of the duel is a lawful compulsion with a nonviolent function inside the government, and they are obligated as a prerequisite to have supported that which is their oath of office, which is the Constitution, and their support for it, their oath to the Constitution, is the qualifier for that position. And if they do these functions with David Bowles, then they are able to get to the next checkpoint in the systems of safeguards of the United States. And if they refuse to do so, then they are insurgents against the Constitution and are perpetually seeking its destruction and thus are disqualified. And to these actions, you have to assert to yourself whether or not the voter fraud from the hate crimes, from the various fraudulent excuses by their access to secrets in order to conduct these subversions, which are understood as the opposition to the position of voter fraud, and other subversions, such as the attack against the rights of due process, in exchange providing the promotion of process, such as Klan rallies and their kangaroo courts, generating predetermined answers, as was promoted by the Confederates for California under their algorithms from their artificial intelligence and fraudulent policies generating to these positions, predetermining outcomes of each of the exchange as a military operation, as California had been captured and overthrown by its enemies, and the state of California ceases to exist or have any functional control, and thus is perpetually under the arbitrary abuses of the Confederacy, which is expressed under the many reports about California, as California Insider and others have reported on, the traumatizing of its economy, and thus the normalization of the natural state of the anarchists under the white supremacist communism, which engages in the function of economic degrowth, and thus political degrowth, and thus insurrection, as the function of the white supremacist power not being challenged by law enforcement or national security, is then functionally asserting itself unto the demonic position of those who should have power are the strongest, and thus the position is the hyperacceleration of loyalty to faction, and thus the division of the factions of the Confederacy, which had to evolve and adapt itself in order to overcome the more powerful United States, which was regaining control against them, had to be seized back by the creation of these factions, such as through William Barr's assertion of unitary executive theory, which is basically just clan terrorism from the false pretense of using government equipment for non official acts, promoting the objective of the central planners of the Wizard Council, generating the hyperacceleration of their war against the United States as its enemy combatants. And to this extent, you have the maturity of the damages, which are highly accelerated variants of the King of England when the United States separated from it, qualifying all of the checks and balances asserted in order to stop these very problems from happening, and thus the obligations and qualifiers for office is to satisfy following them, and to the ends that they do so, they are fit for office, and to the end that they do not, they are an insurrectionist engaged in usurpation for the Klan rallies, lynch mobs, and thus the faction of the absolute arbitrary threat against all peoples, not just those deemed to be inferior, but those that would protect them under some arrogant claim of central law that should have control over the function and thus the assertion of sovereignty to all of the people, regardless of these various factional differences, and thus the disillusionment of political identity in exchange for singular identity of under law. And to the extent that they protect the precedent of under law, they then are an enemy of the Confederacy, which must be destroyed with absolute force, and thus the action of them being more viable qualifies higher investment for more extraordinary tactics, and the less valuable receive less grief, and thus the function of the old saying in Christianity of atheist saying that his life is pretty good and that Christians' lives are pretty hard. Uh, Questions on why he should change anything because his life is quite comfortable. And thus, the answer, of course, from the pastor is that the enemy already has his soul. He has nothing to fight over. And thus, the mechanism of the eternal damnation, the punishment of having let yourself become vulnerable, having not engaged in the cost of business of eternal vigilance in order to protect his liberty, would then be subject to being captured in a state of vulnerability, to be abused maliciously by those demoniac freaks. And to the extent that that becomes true, you then have to realize the function of the hatred of the devils. And some have theorized that the grace of God of having provided lambs and goats and bulls in order to be sacrificed facilitates their inherent threat to having been maliciously torn apart in the demoniac's hellscape. And to the extent that they had to potentially suffer in this exchange, then they would fundamentally rebel against it, and thus the action of having to suffer in order to save the fallen qualifies the absolute aggressive retaliation. And thus the hatred is the fact that they had to suffer for the advantage of these new mud peasants, and the function of the golems of the lower levels, which, having been subordinated inferior to the angels, would then be promoted to this position is some kind of extraordinary insult, and thus the mechanism has perfect excuses in order to generate why they would hate so unconditionally all who would be involved in that. And thus the position of their escape is not possible, and thus the position of their retaliation, of their malice towards and retaliation against those that would, by definition, be freed from those torments of their own poor choices, to be condemning the innocent and to be promoting the guilty, is an extraordinary sin in their eyes, and thus the qualifiers of their malicious retaliation becomes their only satisfying satiation. And thus these devils providing contracts to these mud golems generate the perpetuity of the breaking down of their securities, and thus the mechanism of breaking down of their societies, and thus the mechanism of breaking down their governments, and thus the promotion of their voter frauds, and thus the promotion of their witchcraft, which is the function of rebellion, and thus the action of the rebellion being in perpetuity the exchange by their deals that they contract and disseminate various profits, extenuate the definition of white trash as the function of engaging in the theft out of inherent fundamental poverty. As Dave Chappelle has said, that poverty is a state of mind, and that you can have a lack of money, but you could be poor in your mind. And if you're poor in your mind, you are truly poor. But if don't have a lot of money and you're not poor in your mind, then you are rich. And the functional capacity of you looking in the direction asserts the position of your status. And that being true means, by definition, though someone has extraordinary quantities of wealth and titles and respect, but is themselves poor in mind, they are, in fact, in that position, poor. And thus, the position of their internalized poverty is the definition recycled amongst the white supremacists as white trash. They are perpetually starving, and yet they are unwilling to work and make legal profits. Their theft and scams and subterfuge defining their core identity as the alternative mechanisms of acquiring it through the left hand function, and their devotion to these demoniac functions engages in the actions of the coyotes, which actively engage in the function of their pact tactics and their terrorisms, which is functionally the obligation for their kind, as being able to make respectable incomes legitimately is an attack against their core identity as a poor, and thus the action requires the function of the perpetuity of corrupting and destroying the general society. And to this extent, the higher value that they've opposed being in their estimate David Bull's as the intelligence oversight as a trade for being the aristocracy, having been arrested by the kidnappers for being the patriarchy, allows for the coyotes to disseminate their various crimes around in order to engage in the function of their Confederate anarchy's destruction of the United States, have qualified their extraordinary illusions in their simulations derived by their human trafficking exclusively. To the extent that they do this, they generate the false exchanges which justify their criminal brutalities according to their satanic ritual sacrifices as religious radicals loyal to the adversaries of their society, and doing this under the presumption, according to their studies of the horoscope, of the fire tiger engaging in the function of hunting the coyotes, engages in the restructuring of order, according to the Chinese myth of its horoscope. Then this becomes the status quo function of their entry level understanding of their occult knowledge under the justification for their abuses as clan violence. The tactics of the Confederate insurrectionists engage in the function of blocking official acts or functions of the government. As sedition is fundamentally essential to the action of a parasite infecting a host, and thus the sedition is the poison that the parasite puts into the host so that the immune system does not attack the parasite, and thus protects itself in its war to devour and exterminate as an enemy combatant to the host, and thus the act of the destruction of the system by virtue of falling in line with blocking the remedies to the actions of the parasite and its injuries to the existence of the nation, and thus an act of treason, of aiding and giving comfort to enemies of the United States, as a corruption for the indoctrination and infiltration and assimilation into the insurrection, and thus the permanent barring of the existence of the system by the acts of war against the enforcement of the definition of the system, foreseen by the forefathers who wrote the Constitution and all of the subordinating functions of the concepts of the legal theories of law, and thus the rule of law, and thus the existence of the formation of the government, and thus the capacity for each administration to be changed, including the right of the people to redress grievances by pursuing the government to receive the redress of grievances and to alter and abolish the government in the jurisdiction of Congress by the function defined in the Constitution,